In this video, I want to ask the most basic question, one of the most basic questions we can ask about politics, and that is a particular important person, important agent, rational or not? Well, all human beings are rational unless they are nuts, so we don't want to have a philosophical conversation. So is Vladimir Putin rational? Is in this case a question about how deliberate, how elaborate, patient, sustained his thinking is behind his decisions. And we're going to do this by responding to a couple of things that happened over the past week. There was a massive gathering of Russian troops that you may have heard about around the Ukrainian border, and they've been partly or mostly sent back now. And Alexei Navalny, the main opposition leader in Russia, who has been in jail, about whom there are some videos on this channel, has been on a 23-day-long hunger strike, which he has now ended because the government, in great part, met his demands. We're going to respond to these events and, in light of that, ask what's Putin thinking, how is he making decisions, and what does it mean for us here in the West in terms of how we approach him and make him less of a threat to our safety as we go about our lives. If you want to jump off the video, now I can give you the nugget, and the nugget is basically this. Putin is very slow to make decisions, but his decisions are very piecemeal. He doesn't do long distance strategy. He's thinking, what's the best way of taking advantage of this situation here and now? And I'm not going to think 2 steps ahead. I'm going to think about that when these 2 steps arrive. So I'm going to make a decision as a direct response to what's going on now. I'm not going to think too far ahead, but I will make that tactical, but you can say not so strategic decision very intentionally, very carefully, such that the odds are that years later I'll still have the same view about what I should have done. And then there is another little qualifier, and that's that Putin is relatively badly informed relative to how well you might think he's informed. And that's because he doesn't access the internet and he over-relies on an increasingly dubiously sourced set of folders that arrive on his table. So let's get into this and break this down a bit. So the badly informed bit first. Putin is not by nature a badly informed guy. There are some folks like that we can see even in the West, increasingly, unfortunately, here in the West. Donald Trump. Donald Trump has got a neurodiversity challenge. Even apart from him being a horrible narcissist, he can't take a single thing in and retain it. I'm going to talk about that on another upcoming episode. You've got a guy like Boris Johnson in the UK who is so profoundly irresponsible that he needs to be particularly specially motivated to get knowledgeable about something. He has to have a real selfish interest in it about how he will be personally advantaged. Unless he is, it's hard for him to get deeply interested in something. So these are guys by nature who are going to be badly informed. But the difference is that Putin is not like that. He is somebody who wants to look at the facts. He is somebody who wants to, in a very scrupulous and conservative way, absorb information. But he has less of a chance to do so, because what can the irresponsible clown Boris Johnson do in the UK? That's not a political judgment, it's just a psychological observation. What can he do? He can rely on a very sophisticated civil service and a very sophisticated bureaucracy to get him well informed. Well, he doesn't do that, but he has the resources to get enormously well informed by using the admirable and elaborate resources of the British state. Now, Putin is a well-informed guy constitutionally, psychologically, but his access is really shit. And there have indeed even been stories during the ongoing conflict with the Ukraine of the last few years where Putin's administration has had to rely on oppositional journalists, which they're trying to repress, to get some facts right about what's even happening in their conflict with the Ukraine, because they couldn't discover the facts themselves. That is, interestingly, one of the losses you take if you repress all journalism. You're going to have no objective access to information except through your intelligence services. But of course, as we've noticed, the Russian intelligence services are also a bit of a mess in most of their branches and incarnations. And interestingly, one of the reasons that the Russian regime has not fully clamped down on all journalists, it's not the main reason, but it's one of them. We'll talk about all the reasons in another episode as well. But one of the reasons is that they want to leave some genuine journalists around in case they need to get some facts right and end up having to rely on these few remaining unsuppressed journalists to actually help them discover what's going on in the world and in Russia's spheres of influence. So now Putin is very tactically cautious. He wants to think through any step he makes carefully. But he is not a great strategist. He doesn't even aim to be. So he's not thinking many steps ahead. He's thinking, what's the best thing I can do here and now? Hopefully the consequences will be pretty good in the medium to long term, but I'm not going to go and strain myself over that. I'm just going to make the best tactical short-term decision, but that decision I will think through carefully. So that's the first thing to say. He is interested in being conservative and cautious about arriving at short-term practical judgments and implementing them. But he doesn't want to get too far ahead and implement some kind of grand plan. He wants to react to events as they develop. So it's a certain kind of very sort of brutally realistic picture in the sense that it's heavily informed by the truth that events, and circumstances. And in the beginning is the deed. You've got to respond to what actually happens and frame your politics that way. And there is also something else. Putin has got a very high risk threshold, and unfortunately his risk threshold is increasing, and it's only going to increase further in the future. But that doesn't mean that he is reckless. He's just sitting there and saying, I'm going to exaggerate now, yeah, I'm going to increase my risk threshold by a quarter. That's what I'm going to do, because that's the best way at this point for somebody in my position who is a kind of semi-real, semi-symbolic and powerless leader of Russia, semi-powerful, semi-powerless. Want to know more about that? Watch a couple of Putin videos on this channel. Yeah, somebody in my position should now increase their risk threshold. That's how he thinks. So he is not being reckless by increasing the risk threshold, but his risk threshold is high, and that's worth us knowing. So let's first of all say something very quick about how the original Ukraine conflict went, and then finish up applying Putin's psychology to the events of the past week and seeing what we can learn about how he operates as a rational agent, and indeed how folks like him operate and how we can respond and keep ourselves safe. So, Putin didn't want to do the Ukraine move in 2014 in a sort of heavily planned out, thought through, far ahead sort of way. Not at all. It was a spontaneous reaction. Now, there was a folder probably somewhere saying what to do in case we want to do something with Crimea, but that folder needed to be cleaned up, dusted off, refreshed. It wasn't something that was being built up to. Ukraine entered a period of considerable turmoil. Putin had some pessimistic and to some extent paranoiacal views about where that might lead, with a very heavy, even heavier American and Western control over the Ukraine in his mind, not necessarily in reality. And he thought, well, look, there's an easy opportunity to take Crimea now. We can do it spontaneously. We can do it very quickly. The economic costs will be very severe. Everybody told him, I mean, this is really not going to be good economically. You want to do this? He said, well, it's your job to make it as less shit as possible economically. We're going to do this. So it was a very rational decision, the decision he would still support now, but it was really quite a spontaneous move. It was a response to developments that were not in his control to do with the internal politics in Ukraine. Now, let's look at what's been going on this week. So over the past a few days, the Russians gathered up a bunch of troops on the Ukrainian border. And they were never going to invade. Why not? They weren't going to invade because Putin likes virtual war. He likes hybrid war. He likes war that operates like a tap that you can turn on and off as far as the news cycle goes. So if a war is full scale to the point that he can't turn the tap off at the level of the news cycle, he doesn't want that. So what's an example of that thing that he doesn't want? Well, that might be the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. We go back to the late 70s, early 80s in the Soviet Union. People were not happy with their lives. People struggled. It was difficult to get the basic needs met. You had to battle to do that, whether you're talking about food or supplies or things were just completely sometimes unavailable, like nappies for kids. So that discontent with all of that complex and low and demanding, everyday livelihood situation. Discontent with that was quite dispersed. It wasn't directly aimed at the Politburo with the thought, you guys have got to get out of my life and I want a change of regime. But things went closer to that kind of scenario when body bags began to come back, and when it's not just that there's this government that makes basic foodstuffs unavailable, but there's also this government that seems to be killing our children, killing our male children. We don't like it. In fact, we want this to stop. In fact, we think this is not legitimate. So things went a little bit more in that direction. And you couldn't turn the tap off because the conflict, the scale of the conflict was too significant. There was something on a much, much smaller scale that was similar. And these were the Chechen wars, particularly the first Chechen war in the 1990s, when Russians were not happy with what their government was doing, and Russians were not happy with the impact on, just loss of life. It was unacceptable. So now Putin says, look, we don't want a population that thinks that they're being sacrificed for some kind of geopolitical gains. We can't do that. We're not the sort of regime that can afford vast demographics to be systematically unhappy with us. We've seen that that's happened in Belarus. We've got to avoid that here. We don't do it. So if a war is so major that I can't just change the tune on the TV and start talking about how all homosexuals are bad, or how something else is being conspired against us by the evil Westerners, and if I can't change tack like that, well, that means that whatever I've got involved in is too big, too deep, and too threatening to the stability of the regime. So that's the kind of thinking that will be going in, to the sort of crisis that we just witnessed with the buildup of troops around the Ukrainian border. There's also something else that's going on that's interesting here. Putin doesn't talk much about the Ukraine now. He talks much more about Belarus because he is sensitive that the population has got tired with the Ukraine. We've now got Crimea, the Russians think, and we're not much interested in anything else. So all this stuff about Eastern Ukraine, parts of Eastern Ukraine being further interfered in, further chopped off by the Russians, well, that doesn't really interest the Russian population. Putin knows that. He doesn't want to go there. So much so that, in fact, he's distancing himself from the decisions that are being made and presenting himself not as the commander-in-chief of whatever is going on, but as a sort of arbiter between people around him who are making decisions. And one of the successes of him casting that image is that it's possible for a lot of Russians to think, well, hang on, I don't like what's being done, but actually, if Putin wasn't there, the situation might be worse, and it might not be him anyway that's making some of these decisions. So, this is quite an interesting kind of deflective strategy that's very well thought through, and it's being used by him. Let's look at perhaps the unfreest man, one of the unfreest people in Russia, Alexei Navalny, who is psychologically in many ways very free, but he is in jail and he has been on a 23-day hunger strike, which he has now ended because he needed to be seen by civilian doctors. He wanted his own doctors to see him. That didn't happen, but civilian doctors saw him and gave some test results to Navalny's own doctors. And there's some prospect that his conditions in prison might improve for now. And so this was the first challenge he faced. So why did the Russian government, and in this case this decision will be directly couriered by Vladimir Putin, why did the Russian government meet Navalny's demands to get at least some kind of access to medical care? That's not the only thing that happened. There were some protests over the last few days all over Russia, and the protests in Moscow in particular generated very little suppression. There were very few arrests, and atypically most people were just sort of allowed to come out, protest without consequences. Now, we shouldn't overstate this, because the people who were on the street can be tracked down and something bad might happen to them 2 years from now. But nevertheless, this seeming leniency is interesting. So what's the logic here? What's going on? Well, we don't need to discuss the logic on Navalny's part. Navalny needed some of his demands to be met. Navalny is fighting for his life, not just his political career. And it doesn't make any sense to just sacrifice your life, while making demands about needs of yours that need to be met so that you can survive. So as soon as some of his needs were met, it was clear that he was going to stop his hunger strike. That's just sensible. But what's happening on Putin's side? Why wouldn't Putin just let Navalny struggle on and have his health deteriorate further and further, not help him, not meet any of his demands? Why would Putin not clamp down harder on protesters? Navalny is not fully Putin's enemy in Putin's mind. What Navalny is for Putin is a guy who occupies a place that might eventually be taken up by a very serious enemy. And that can only happen if, and actually everyone thinks, including Putin himself, when the regime weakens or runs aground and various crises happen. So there is no point for Putin to knock Navalny out completely as a political agent. I mean, he could do that, but there is no necessary need to do that, because Navalny is for him a placeholder for what will be a future existential threat to his place in power. At the moment, that existential threat is not there, but if you like, the seeds of it are there. And when Putin manages Navalny, he is managing the seeds of the future existential threat to him. And, he doesn't necessarily need to rip out all the seeds, because some other seeds will appear. They could be better than Navalny from Putin's point of view. They could be worse. I mean, we don't need to overthink this or over-gamble on this. We just need to sort of massage and manage the situation. Much the same is happening with the protest response. So, on this occasion, we don't have to hit people hard. We don't have to do something dramatic. Why? Because we're not really facing any threat. What we are doing is we're sort of making some marking the terrain of a future theater of conflict, which is not here yet. So, we would potentially clamp down on these people if they really constitute a threat to us. But at the moment, we are looking, we're reflecting, we're massaging the situation, we're watching who comes out. We like surprising people, we like clamping down and sometimes relaxing a little bit more, than clamping down even harder, than doing something altogether left field. So we're doing this because we're not engaged in proper warfare yet. We're just sort of in a stage where the territory is being marked out. And what we're always thinking about is, how do we increase our readiness for a scenario when we are genuinely considerably weakened, when the threats posed to us by Navalny or some future incarnation of Navalny are real, and when not thousands but hundreds of thousands and millions of people want to come out onto the street? What do we do about that? So that's the logic there. And so you might see a kind of inconsistency in the actions of the Russian government. They seem to go hard, sometimes they seem to go disproportionately soft, they're not consistent. It's not clear why they are going so hard after Alexei Navalny, but yet they are not interested in killing him, except when they are interested in killing him. And even there, it's possible that they were going to do something with his poisoning that was in their minds a situation that would just go either way. I mean, if he dies, there are some advantages here. If he survives, there are also some advantages here potentially. So this is not complete ineptitude, complete incompetence, even though a lot of these organizations, a lot of the bureaucratic infrastructure is indeed very incompetent. But there is some thought there. And the basic nugget there is, this is not the theater of war. This is just a kind of rehearsal that's on the real theater of war, where the war isn't yet being fought. But we're just checking out the terrain, marking things up. Why is my rant important beyond the particular case of one country and the leader of one country? Well, it's because our safety in the 21st century is predicated not only on us meeting the biggest challenges like the climate crisis, it's also predicated on the major players on the global stage being able to successfully anticipate one another's intentions and motivations, and not be too deceived about what the motivations of their opponents and enemies are. And so often what's true is that the biggest threat isn't the level of disagreement, the level of incompatible conflicting interest, but in fact the capacity of the major agents on the global stage to be engaged in good quality perception and good quality dialogue around one another's intentions, around one another's motivations. Hit the bell button, and we're going to talk again about everything that's important in this world in which we live, in which we share.